To drive a DeLorean, it's a completely different experience. From the moment you sit into it and opening up a gull-wing door.
I was a teenager about the time that the DeLorean came out back in 1981, and it just was so different than anything else out there.
There's always a story to be told about DeLoreans. John DeLorean started his career as an engineer with General Motors.
From that point, he rose very quickly through GM to be the youngest vice president, and by the early 70s, he was in charge of Chevrolet. I think John DeLorean felt hamstrung a bit within the constraints of General Motors. He wanted to build a car that was the way he thought they should be built.
And that would last beyond the regular model cycle of cars lasting 2 or 3 years and then rusting away.
John knew that in order to have his car stand out in the marketplace, it needed to be different. Stainless provided a unique solution to that by obviously not rusting, and it also solved the problem of having to put very expensive paint facilities in at the factory. The gull-wing doors had only been used on a couple of other cars prior to that. John intended for the car to be an extremely safe car, and after working with the car as long as we have here, about 30 years, yeah, that is the case.
You know, they got quite a lot right the first go-round.
The first prototypes were completed 76, 77. While they were looking for a place to build the factory, they very quickly discovered, as soon as they mentioned they were going to add about 2,000 to 2,500 jobs, lots of governments came to them saying, we'd like you to build the factory here. So John began to shop for the best financial deal because he knew that it would take a lot of money. But then the Northern Ireland Development Agency came through in 1978. They started with a greenfield plant of about 90 acres. They were able to build a factory, design a car, hire people, train people, and start production in the span of about 28 months, which is a record that probably still stands today 30 years later. The first cars were built and they started to ship to dealers in the summer of 1981.
The auto industry was in a slump. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and bump, out comes this car that looked like nothing else before.
The stainless body and the gull-wing doors, it was a spaceship on wheels.
The press was a buzz.
Initial public response was fantastic.
Everybody was going nuts for it. It was a showstopper. You'd pull up and there would be crowds around them.
There were some reports of people paying more than $10,000 over sticker price.
Everybody would be clamoring to see one and touch one, which is still the same now. Everybody has to touch a DeLorean, you know.
Troubles for the company first really started in late 1981. In order to improve the stock offering that was planned, they needed to be building a certain number of cars and have a certain number of people employed. John took a gamble and ordered production of the car doubled.
As far as the economy was concerned, interest rates were extremely high.
And we got hit with the worst winter in about 30 years. So car sales pretty much dropped almost to nothing.
So it was extremely difficult to sell anything, let alone an expensive sports car.
The factory kept going building these cars, hoping that the market would turn around in time. By early '82, it was clear that that wasn't going to happen. John lost control of the factory in May 1982. He needed to come up with a certain amount of money to regain control of the factory. About this time, he was approached by one of his neighbors, and he told John that he could help him get any kind of money he needed. In the summer of '82, when John realized, that this was some kind of a drug deal, he tried to back out. According to his testimony, his family was threatened. They threatened to cut his daughter's head off and send it home in a shopping bag. So he didn't feel he had any option except to continue to go along with the deal. It turns out that this was a sting operation.
I think the DEA at that period wanted a big bust, wanted to make a name for themselves.
In late October of '82, he was arrested. By the time John DeLorean went to trial in 1984, the company was gone. It filed for bankruptcy. The factory contents had been sold or auctioned off.
The DEA actually set him up, and it was entrapment. Truth be known is he never went to jail. He was completely acquitted of all the drug charges.
When the factory closed in late 1982, there was literally millions of parts to build cars still in the factory. And it's that inventory which we now have in our facility here. We've got a 40,000 square foot facility full of literally millions new old stock, brand new 30-year-old DeLorean parts. Out of the 2,800 or so different parts it takes to make up a DeLorean, we've got better than 98% parts availability. One of the other things that we acquired with this inventory of parts was a complete set of engineering drawings and all the engineering records for the parts on the car. So as we run out of stuff, we have a network of suppliers and manufacturers all around the world who we work with to have some of these parts reproduced. You can't talk about DeLorean cars without talking about Back to the Future. In the earliest versions of the script, they had intended to use a refrigerator as the time machine, and quickly realized, that they didn't want kids climbing into refrigerators, because back in the days they had doors that couldn't open from the inside, and they decided it would be easier to use some kind of an automobile since the company went out of business. It's been the greatest thing to happen to the DeLorean car. I guarantee that someplace in the world right now, one of those movies is on TV someplace, so someone new is being exposed to the DeLorean car for the first time. John left a legacy in the form of 9,000 or so cars that bear his name. I think one of the reasons the DeLorean remains sort of timeless, because the DeLorean never went through that evolutionary process. Because that didn't happen, the DeLorean is essentially frozen in time.
And as decades go, there are always certain things that stick out, and DeLorean is definitely, an iconic part of the 80s. Had DeLorean had survived that period in time and continued, there would be a big 4 now, there wouldn't be a big 3. DeLorean himself, he made DeLorean and he also took it down. As the story goes, apparently, on the day that he was actually arrested, they actually had an investment bank lined up. So they'd actually arranged for the resurrection of the company, and all he had to do was sign the document. And they were looking for him all day, they couldn't find him. And then the next thing they heard, that he was on the 6 o'clock news as having been arrested in Los Angeles airport. And that was the end of it. The financing went away, and they just had that one last chance, and it didn't happen.